Hello, I'm Jim Townsend, Director of the Levin Center for Oversight and Democracy at Wayne State University Law School. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion entitled Improving the User Experience with Government While Fighting Fraud, Waste, and Abuse. This is the second of a two-part series on this topic, both of which will be available on our website at levin-center.org. Now, I'm going to serve as the moderator of this panel, and before I introduce our distinguished guests, our guest panelists, let me just say how important we at the Levin Center think this topic is. At the Levin Center, we focus on elevating the theory and practice of legislative oversight as a vital element of democracy. We are headquartered in Detroit, Michigan, and we have an office in Washington, D.C., and among a number of things that we do, we provide training and technical assistance to lawmakers and staff in Congress and in state legislatures around the country, focusing on how to conduct in-depth, bipartisan, fact-based legislative oversight. This series on putting people at the center of government services and using oversight to foster a human-centered approach to governance is just essential to our mission. So we're so pleased to be able to put on this series. Our first panel, which aired on May 10th on Friday, just last Friday, talked about strategies for enabling the government to adopt a build, measure, learn approach to providing government services. This enables the government to learn about the way its services are affecting the people it is seeking to help, and it enables it to adjust to improve that user experience. We explored not only how to implement this approach, but also the role that legislative oversight can play in encouraging government agencies to adopt human-centered strategies. In today's conversation, we turn our attention to how the government can improve access to public services while ensuring program integrity. In other words, while minimizing waste, fraud, and abuse. Are these goals in tension with each other? If so, do they have to be? And what role does oversight, whether that is coming from an inspector general or from the legislature, play in advancing human-centered and highly efficient and effective approaches to government? Now, I will introduce our panelists, ask a series of questions to sort of prompt our discussion, and then about 12:40 Eastern time, 12:45-ish, we will welcome and open things up to audience questions, which you can submit via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So with that out of the way, let me introduce our distinguished panelists who bring really deep and diverse points of view to these issues. First, we have Michele Evermore, a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, where she focuses on policy for improving the nation's social insurance programs. She's one of the nation's leading authorities on unemployment insurance, and she most recently served as Deputy Director for Policy in the fairly newly formed Office of Unemployment Insurance Modernization at the U.S. Department of Labor. Next, we have Michael Horowitz, who has served as Inspector General of the U.S. Department of Justice since 2012. As Inspector General, Michael oversees a nationwide workforce of more than 500 special agents, auditors, inspectors, and attorneys, and support staff whose mission is to detect and deter waste, fraud, abuse, and misconduct in DOJ programs and personnel, and to promote economy and efficiency in department operations. Since April 2020, Michael has also led the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, or PRAC, which is a committee of 22 federal inspectors general that Congress created to oversee the $5 trillion in federal pandemic-related emergency spending that has come about. And from 2015 to 2020, Michael also served as chair of the Council of the Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency. That's known as CIGI. And that's an organization comprised of all 75 inspectors general. Next, we have Alaska State Senator James Kaufman. Senator Kaufman worked as a quality manager and team lead in improving quality and efficiency in North Slope energy projects in Alaska for all of his career. But after retiring from that position, he got involved in public service. He helped organize public events to improve community resilience in the face of potential disasters such as fire and earthquake, eruptions and pandemics. And then he ran for public office in 2020, first getting elected to the House of Representatives in Alaska. He now serves as an Alaska State Senator representing District F. And he has been very active in helping to lead oversight efforts as part of the Joint Legislative Budget and Audit Committee. He also chairs the Transportation Committee. And finally, Jennifer Pahlka, who is making a return appearance in our two-part series. She is a senior fellow at the Levin Center and the Federation of American Scientists. She has served as Deputy Chief Technology Officer of the United States under President Obama, and is a member of the Defense Innovation Board under both the Obama and Trump administrations. She founded the award-winning nonprofit Code for America, which she ran for 10 years. And her book, Recoding America, which really was, I must say, the inspiration for this series, is a really insightful look at the issues and problems caused by a government that is not putting users at the center of their operations and their thinking. Ezra Klein called Recoding America one of the best policy books I've ever read, and a book I wish all policymakers would read. So, panelists, let me first thank all of you for joining us today. It's a great privilege for us to be with you. And I'd like to kind of kick things off with a question on how you view improving access to public services while also ensuring program integrity. In other words, minimizing waste, fraud, and abuse. Are these goals in tension with each other? If so, do they have to be? And maybe we'll kick it off with you, Jennifer, if you would start off, but I'd really love to hear from each of you, provide your sort of, your take on that question.
Oh, I'm happy and honored to kick it off, and also happy and honored to be here and be part of this discussion. It's so important, especially given what happened during the pandemic. So do we always need to make a choice between low fraud and accessibility? I think that the answer is when we are operating in a low capacity environment, we are often forced to make those choices. On the other hand, we also just get very bad fraud and low accessibility. So it's not even really a choice in many regards. I think pre-pandemic, that was seen to be the choice. But from what I've seen, especially in unemployment insurance systems, and had the pleasure of working with Michele on this during the pandemic, what was really missing was the capacity of the agencies to deliver this. It's very outsourced. In California, where I worked on a strike team with the appointed by the governor to help clear the backlog that had accrued in this first summer of the pandemic, it was really clear that they didn't really know how their own systems worked. They were extremely burdened by lots and lots of accumulated regulations over the years. And they were, of course, as all states were, subject to both a huge backlog and enormous fraud. Now, we did deal with the backlog, but of course, the fraud, I think, mitigated once we put in an ID verification system. But had we had significant increases in the capacity of that state before the pandemic hit, and I don't just mean money, we often conflate capacity with money, but I mean true capacity to actually understand our systems and deliver based on what the program is supposed to do and the needs of the people in a safe environment where fraud can be reduced, we would not have had to make that trade-off.
Others want to chime in, provide your perspective on this issue?
Sure, I'll jump in just briefly because I agree. I mean, I agree. I think what we saw during the pandemic was the lack of preparedness come home. As soon as the pandemic hit, agencies thought they could get along with where they were before March 2020, and then March 2020 came along, and it was clear agencies simply were not prepared technologically. Their systems were out of date. There are a lot of failures that we can talk about. I think one of the most frustrating things for us as oversight officials, whether you're talking inspectors general, GAO, Government Accountability Office, or state auditors, who we've worked with, by the way, quite closely through this process, is the false choice that was put forward, which was that there were only two choices, which was get the money out right away. If there's a national crisis, the money must go out yesterday. And we're just going to get the money out and we'll sort it out later. That was the choice that was actually followed for the largest programs. And by the way, when we talk largest programs, we're talking about primarily two that became of issue here. One was the two SBA programs, Small Business Administration programs, Paycheck Protection Program and Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. So SBA's two programs, which by the way accounted for more than 20% of all pandemic spending. Over $1 trillion went out through SBA of the $5 trillion. And then you had UI, unemployment insurance, through the Labor Department, which was another about 800 billion plus. Those two account for $2 trillion of the pandemic spending. And this notion was we have to get all of that money out as quickly as we can. Versus the false narrative being the other choice was we take weeks and months to make it perfect. And what I've talked about over and over again is there are not just two choices. There is a trade-off and a range of choices, as Jennifer just said, between getting money out and not caring at all about guardrails versus grinding everything to a halt while you try and perfect and ensure not $1 goes to somebody it shouldn't go to. And what happened in the pandemic was to get the money out, you figure it out later, what we refer to as the pay and chase model. We agencies are going to pay the money and you oversight professionals go chase it later, resulted in hundreds of billions of dollars in fraud and hundreds of billions of dollars within that fraud, improper payments. And the failure of the agencies was not appreciating, at the outset of the pandemic, was not appreciating that by going with that model, it meant that hundreds of billions of dollars didn't go to the people who desperately needed the money. Every dollar that went to a fraudster from SBA didn't go to a small business that needed it. And every dollar that went to unemployment insurance benefits to a fraudster didn't go to the unemployed that needed it. And that complete, that near complete lack of consideration, led to these guardrails going down and the money going out. And there clearly needs to be thinking about where on that spectrum it should be, but even the simplest controls weren't followed. Like, as I'm sure we'll talk about, checking with treasuries already existing do not pay system. And that's the problem that we faced at the outset. And agencies clearly need to be better prepared. And we have a lot of lessons learned from this pandemic that are now confronting agencies as they think about these issues.
Jim, could I add a quick example to what I said earlier in line with what Michael's saying? In California and many states at the time, there was no system in place for identity verification of applicants. When we got that working in California, both fraud went down and the backlog cleared. So perfect example of how you get more of both things that you want. But prior to the pandemic, California, and again, many other states, had been preparing for a modernization. That modernization didn't include an ID verification system. It was meant to sort of put the system on new technology in some way where the goals of it were not clear. That is what I mean by low capacity, not just low capacity of the system itself to not have ID verification, but low capacity of the agency to understand what they actually need in order to get both of these better outcomes.
I think that, like, ideally there should not be tension between paying benefits on time to the right people and not paying the wrong people. That to me, program integrity means you're paying the right people, the right time, the right benefit. right now, states are not meeting timeliness standards, and it goes back to the pandemic backlog. One thing I will say about ID verification, I mean, part of this is just the incredible complexity of running a UI program most people don't appreciate, but that Jen lays out really well in her book. And it's that states are running on outdated technology. They hit the pandemic with a 50-year low in administrative funding. The highest initial claims on record was 695,000 in October of 1983. We were seeing 6.6 million in consecutive weeks in new applications, and that's notwithstanding standing up brand new programs. I think the problem is, and right now what we see is funding, sort of flattening again, and states still don't have the resources to modernize their technology in a reasonable way, and so there really is a lack of resources and attention between paying benefits timely and paying and preventing fraud. And there's not a lot of resources at this point in investigating which fraud solutions do what. So we actually don't really know which states are using which fraud solutions for which part of, for which claimants, or whether those flags are accurate. We see states increasingly very, very aware of the liability of fraud, and so they're throwing every solution at it, and we're not really studying which solutions are getting in the way of people getting benefits and unnecessarily, and which ones are actually capturing fraud. And so I think that the solution from here on out has to be providing states with the resources they need to develop technology that both pays benefits on time but not to the wrong people, and studying which interventions that states are paying for that work. Essentially fighting this new kind of fraud has been an unfunded mandate for states. The reason states didn't do ID verification before the pandemic was because in order to get a regular unemployment insurance benefit, the employer who just let you go has to verify that you were fired for reasons beyond your control and that you deserve a benefit. And that's going to increase that employer's experience rating. And so they will have to pay more. So, relying on that as, a verification that the right person is asking for the right benefit is a pretty high bar. But unfortunately, the fraudsters have found the program and are inventing all kinds of ways to circumvent that. But prior to the pandemic, fraud was a very different thing, and we didn't need the same tools that we need now. So, yeah.
Senator Kaufman, what are your thoughts on this initial question?
In my experience, systems that deliver a poor user experience for the customer client are usually fairly dreadful to live within. So I think there's a natural compatibility between what improves the user experience versus relative to what improves that for the service providers. If you think of waste, fraud, and abuse, often people are dealing with a volume of work that is, part of it is artificial. You have the core work that's the real work, and then you have the additional that's been piled on through fraudulent claims in the cases that we're talking about. So systems that can align the delivery with the balanced workload and deliver a better user experience, I think it's all part of a system that's designed well to deliver, and it's still early here, I still have my first cup of coffee, to deliver what's essential in services, but also a reasonable workload that's possible for the people delivering the product. So I don't think that there's necessarily a tension there other than the creative tension of incorporating the voice of the customer that receives the service or product and those that deliver it. And all of that is stakeholder engagement, designing systems that work with the people that have to deliver it and the people that receive the product. So to me, it's all part of the same continuum. A system that delivers dreadful service is usually pretty dreadful to work in, and the reasons are very often paired or at least related.
Excellent. Now I want to touch on the issues that we brought up so far in the conversation from each of your perspectives. So I'm just going to start kind of randomly, just in asking, starting with you, Michael. I've read some of your commentary about what has happened, what happened during the pandemic, and you mentioned from your perspective as chair of PRAC that there's a data analytics center that PRAC has built that has done a lot of great work. And I've heard you say that, had that been in place previously, we could have prevented a lot of the fraud that occurred. So I'm just, we've talked about capacity and knowledge and access to data. To what extent is what you and your colleagues have been doing through PRAC given sort of a model for how to approach this challenge?
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, no, it is something that's been a challenge. One of the things we figured out and thought right away at the PRAC was we weren't going to be able to oversee $5 trillion of spending without having some sophisticated analytics usage. You just can't do that. And what we saw was, to what each of the panelists just talked about, was the lack of such systems at the agency level, and the lack of cross-agency ability to check information, including, by the way, at the state workforce agencies at the state level. And they created a UI integrity hub that is much more advanced post-pandemic than it was pre-pandemic to try and deal with some of that issue. So, for example, one of the things that we did was we used our data analytics information, and our statisticians, analysts, mathematicians identified about 2.7 million suspect Social Security numbers out of the 35 million SBA-related programs applications. And we took those 2.7 million applications and entered into an agreement with Social Security Administration, where we sent them, based on the application information we had. We didn't want their Social Security information for privacy reasons, other reasons. But what we did was, for those 2.7 million applications, we sent them the name, date of birth, and Social Security number that the applicant put on what we viewed as potentially suspicious application. We asked them just for yes/no answers to 3 questions. Is it a real Social Security number? If it is a real Social Security number, obviously if it isn't, we've got our answer. If it is a real Social Security number, does the name match and the date of birth match what's in your system for that Social Security number? Yes, no. And then finally, 3rd question, is the person living or dead? And based on that, we got back over 100,000 suspicious Social Security numbers. That match of 2.7 million took Social Security Administration about 2 weeks to get us the information. So one of the points we've made is, had there been, first of all, we did not have an analytics platform. We had to build one in 2021 because Congress and the administration back in 2015 let the prior platform go away. But had that platform been available, we could have done just a basic match. And by the way, that 100,000 plus suspicious identities equated to $5.4 billion in money that went out the door, right? Just that alone, 5.4 billion. And that's not, this is one of the things I think worth talking about. That's not using sophisticated tools. That's with 3 questions off an application to the Social Security Administration for a simple match. And one of the things that's been a challenge is getting agencies and administration and Congress to move forward and say, we need to start somewhere. There's often this effort of the perfect being the enemy of the good, not having a pilot, not trying something. Identity verification is very hard issues, raises a lot of issues. And I've learned more in the last 4 years about the challenges there than I ever knew. And I thought I had some idea coming into this job what they were. And yet we still can't get a pilot going or a test going because there's this desire to bite off the whole problem as opposed to sort of trying it out. And I think that's what we're trying to look at here from our standpoint as oversight, with oversight responsibilities. Let's start using data, but let's not get bogged down in trying to get perfect. Let's try some test concepts like we just did and show how you can identify $5.4 billion in potential fraud. And getting a head start on this.
Do others want to chime in on Michael's example? Do you have other examples you'd like to share on this?
I'll just offer that simple thing of, I mean, that the check is basically a spreadsheet. It's not, a lot of times these things are not that difficult. It's just slowing the world down and deciding to do it. And the low-hanging fruit can be massive gains in just taking those simple first steps that Michael describes. It doesn't have to be complicated or particularly elegant. Just get started on it.
So this is where I think it's important from the Levin Center's perspective, at least, to talk about the influence of legislative oversight or other administrative oversight mechanisms to this this question about whether, as Michael described, you're comfortable trying simple things or things that maybe don't solve the entire problem, but are at least making significant progress. It seems like what this speaks to is sort of the way that government deals with failure. So I thought I would ask you all about sort of the culture that we have in many government programs and hierarchies around what happens when things go wrong, or what kind of attitude is in play when you have failures, and is that a relevant sort of that culture? How does that play into this situation we've seen where the government tends to either do nothing or it seeks to implement a wide change that is more than they can really bite off and handle effectively?
I'll take a piece of that.
Okay.
Yeah, what I've seen in government is that the science and art of change management is not well understood. Often people see the goal that they're seeking and they start going towards it, but they don't really see all of the steps and the obstacles that are in the way, and don't really have a good plan for managing that change. So one of the things that I deal with quite frequently now that I'm in government is trying to get people onto a path of starting with the problem statement and actually working it through to completion. And when the pieces and parts are misaligned in that the delta between where you are now experiencing the problem and where you want to be, it's I'll say with the nature of government, with the constant change in personnel and players and changing of goals and objectives, it's very hard to manage effectively a continuous and continually improving condition. So I think the change management processes are something that I've been focusing on, working with people to see not only what they want to do, but what it's actually going to take to get there. And I think many failed initiatives or initiatives that get implemented and then fall backwards after a time are because they ran into unforeseen obstacles that weren't properly visioned when the problem statement and solution goals were being created. And it just results in many false starts and short-term fixes that don't really address the problem. So for me, that's one of the key areas and one of the most enjoyable areas to work in government is around trying to get people tuned up on change management processes to effect beneficial change as opposed to just mucking around in the system for a while and then getting tired of it.
To that end, one of the things that we did when I was at the U.S. Department of Labor was, I think that there was pressure for us to just write the one computer that rules them all, when there's 53 entirely different technology systems built on 53 entirely different foundational, legislation, and with 53 entirely different business practices and different ways of asking people questions. So one of the first things we did was develop tiger teams to go to states and actually do an inventory, an in-depth study, actually based on Jen's strike team work, that really dig into an individual system and find out what their challenges are and try to clear out some of the low-hanging fruit and get quick wins, but also to help understand what are these differences and how can we share lessons across states, and what lessons and what things fundamentally can't be shared across states because they're so different. And those tiger teams reached by the time the funding was rescinded by Congress in the debt ceiling deal, they'd reached, I think, 35 states. And each engagement got increasingly in-depth and increasingly sophisticated. If we could keep doing stuff like that, I think that would really help states figure out, A, what's possible with their system, but B, what have other states done what are lessons that they've learned that we could actually learn from? Unfortunately, that funding's gone, and we're in between recessions, so unemployment insurance is just not that interesting to the world, and it's very hard to get funding and attention on the issue.
Yeah, I'll second that, and I'd love to pick up on something Senator Kaufman said. We do often misunderstand the problem. I think the example of California sort of modernizing to modernize without having clear goals is an example of that. I also saw in that particular engagement, and have seen in other places, that you have, the legislature thinks they know what the solution is. In the case of California, the solution appeared to be to hire, I think at the time it was 5,000 people, and more every day once the strike team started. And it turned out that those 5,000 people, of course, and I think Michele knew this all the time, like they couldn't actually process claims. They're not trained to do so, and they're not legally allowed to do so. But they were taking up all the time of the experienced claims processor. So it turned out that every new person that EDD hired slowed processing instead of sped it. And I saw many oversight hearings in which the well-intentioned members of the legislature asked the head of EDD over and over again, where are you on hiring? Why aren't you hiring faster? And so, I think part of that change management Senator Kaufman's talking about is being able to look at the system from the bottom up instead of what looks like it might be the answer from the top. But it's hard to have that humility, and it's really hard to dive down, into that system and really be asking for the right things, essentially. But I saw very clearly in that example this accountability trap that public servants are stuck in. They're held accountable to following the processes that are in place. And when things go wrong, they really want to follow the processes in place because they know they're going to be under enormous scrutiny. Well, during the pandemic, those processes were absolutely the wrong things to be following. So we're holding them accountable also to the outcomes, but the two things are in really distinct tension from each other. And I think one of the biggest things that we could do to change the culture, speaking to this, this change management, it's not just what agency leaders do, it's the environment in which agency leaders operate. And oversight is primarily about finding what went wrong and making sure we learn from it. So I think it's obviously very important, and I value it very highly. But we don't create an environment in which public servants believe that they will be rewarded for being more faithful to the outcomes than the process. And part of that is because they never see what good looks like. I have the sort of last couple of chapters of my book about some fantastic public servants who do, sort of at risk to their own careers, do the thing that they know they should do, even though it's not exactly standard operating procedure. And through that, they get fantastic outcomes. This is a particular program that was brought on Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services after healthcare.gov. And they know they can't just say, well, we followed directions because it didn't work the previous time. But we don't spend any of our oversight, or we rarely spend our oversight energy looking at those public servants and seeing what they did and lifting them up and say, this is what good looks like. This is what we want public servants to do. So they only know the 7,000 ways to get in trouble. And I think that creates a culture where change management is really hard because they know they'll be held accountable to these processes.
Yeah, can I jump in and just pick
Please,
up on
yeah.
that? Because one of the things that we did change in 2021, after the change in administration, one of the things that President Biden had done back when he was vice president was to lead the work with IGs that had been set up to look at the Recovery Act back in 2009. That back then, the enormous sum of $800 billion, right? We're now talking $5 trillion. So we're at a way higher magnitude than then. And so one of the things that happened in 2021 was Gene Sperling was given responsibility to oversee implementation of the various pandemic programs, and he reached out to me as chair of the PRAC and to the other IGs to say he'd been basically told, follow the model that happened in 2009, because that was a very effective collaborative model between IGs and agencies. And one of the things that we did, of what Jennifer was just talking about, was we created what some have referred to now as gold standard meetings, where before programs were implemented or further money was given out, got in a virtual room, because we're now in the pandemic, with the agency leadership, the White House implementation team, OMB leadership, the PRAC leadership, and the IG from that agency. And the purpose of that meeting, before the money went out the door, was to have the agency present what it thought were the controls it should have in place and how it should move forward. And it allowed us to give our feedback as oversight professionals. It allowed OMB to weigh in, which has an interest that's generally aligned with making sure, obviously, funds go to the right people. And it changed the dynamic. And some of that responsibility beforehand was on agencies, some was on IGs, but there was this sort of general risk, as Jennifer explained, of we're there afterwards to critique what happened, as opposed to being called on by the agencies and the IG's willingness to come beforehand and say, we've seen this before, or here are the problems we've seen before. You should be aware of them. How are you going to come up with innovative ways to not do the same thing all over again? And that has worked tremendously well. We've done 30 to 40 of these meetings over the last several years. And it really has changed, I think, in a very positive way, how people look at each other from the oversight side and the agency implementation side.
Let me jump in and just build on that point. What it sounds to me like you're describing, Michael, and really Jennifer, you as well, is a less adversarial form of oversight. And this is something that in the work we do at the Levin Center around the country with state legislatures, where there is less staffing and capacity to do oversight. And so by sort of naturally, and Senator Kaufman, you could probably chime in on this, naturally, you've got to be collaborating more with your auditors, inspectors general, other agencies than you might in Congress. But my question is, where does Congress fit in that? Or where does legislative oversight fit? Can it be more collaborative, less adversarial in these kinds of circumstances where that kind of approach is really harmful? Is there a way to do that, or have you seen that work? I think the answer is no. Well, I think therein lies the problem. We need to have lawmakers who are taking more responsibility for the program at the outset, and understanding that when they pass legislation, it isn't over, it's only beginning. And that, can lawmakers, again, they don't have the capacity and the staffing to do certain types of oversight that get into the weeds farther than lawmakers can go. But they set a culture and they set expectations. And I guess I'm wondering if there's a way that we can encourage, Congress and state legislatures to foster this sort of gold standard meeting approach, if you will, rather than this sort of like, well, we're going to wait until you trip and then we're going to jump on you.
There's legislation that I'm attempting to move, but to put it in context, first you have to imagine Alaska as an area over twice the size of Texas, with about 700,000 people in it. So this massive area, much of it not served by roads. You can only get there by dog sled or airplane or sometimes boat. A very small community in a very massive area that's very diverse, geologically, climate-wise, et cetera. So we have tremendous challenges and a very small group of people to deal with it. One of the core pieces of legislation I'm attempting to do is to get our entire state government working on 4-year strategic operating plans that are then on a rolling cadence every 2 years. They're updated to bring alignment around a plan. What you find in government, you get a new boss comes in and everything's changing. We're going off into a new direction. Systems are unable to deal with that. They're rigid on purpose, but then there's also a challenge with that rigidity. So what I think can help if we all have at least a common plan and operating system, at least speaking for Alaska population wise, a small state where it's amazing, the 7 degrees of separation in Alaska, we have about 2. So everybody in some way knows each other, and it's an amazing place for that kind of networking, but it also drives a certain community approach that might be a little different than a more populous state. So if we can get Alaska running on these 4-year strategic operating plans where our budgeting discussions are around performance against the plan, that'll improve transparency. It'll improve awareness of the key goals and objectives. And I think that will really help the executive branch and the legislative branch better align on what we're doing. If our budgeting conversations, our annual budgeting conversations are more shaped around this longer term plan and what we're trying to do to manage to a higher operating state than where we're currently at now. So plan alignment, better understanding of the change management tools and the processes that are around it. Incentivizing government is particularly hard because you don't have the tools that are natural in the private sector. So you have to come up with a different vocabulary for incentivizing than what you would have in the private sector. So I don't want to keep going on too much, but those are the things that I see that can help improve our state of operations, at least in this small population but vast territorial states such as Alaska.
One thing about those strategic operating plans is that they're aligning on goals. I think, what you'll hear from a lot of agency leaders is it's not clear what my goal is. And of course, your goal changes dramatically once a crisis hits. But I like that because it's engaging sort of on the capacity and operating plan of the agency up front. And I think there needs to be a lot more of that. And Jim, you brought up this, it's not just the oversight, it's how the legislative body deals with the agency when they're dropping legislation on them. And one key insight for my work on unemployment insurance during the pandemic was just the sheer volume of regulations that these programs are subject to. Michele wrote a great report about New Jersey as a positive example, speaking to my earlier point about let's lift up those who are doing a great job. And Commissioner Asara Angelo in New Jersey, when he was called up in front of the legislature, brought the 7,119 pages of policy and regs that govern his state's UI system and plopped them on the table and sort of kept pointing to them. And I think he's absolutely right about that. We always add and never subtract. And in California, there was this one claims processor who said to my colleague, over and over again, I'm new, I still don't understand this system. And when she finally asked him how long he'd been there, the new guy, he said, oh, I've only been here 17 years. The folks who really know how to process a claim have been here 25 years or longer, and they're confused too, because everything's changing in the pandemic. But what that's really led me to conclude, especially sort of my work since the book, I get asked to the Hill sometimes to talk about what mandates and controls they might put on a particular agency that they see underperforming, in a crisis or not, or just, agencies with sort of poor performance histories. And my answer to them is, you've been adding mandates and controls to that agency for 30 years now. How's it going? And, when you think about it that way, they go like, yeah, that's not working. But we don't know any other framework in which to operate. And my answer there is an enablement and capacity building framework in which what you do is still write legislation, conduct oversight, all of the things you do, but you do it differently with different sort of mindset, asking the agencies what they need instead of adding controls, maybe removing some of those controls and constraints, trying to help them truly understand the problem and let them take ownership over it instead of, asking for ever more specific things that then sort of take away their agency, so to speak, the agency of the agency, so that they can say, I did exactly what you told me to do. It's not my fault that we didn't get the outcome, but really, push it back on them and align on goals, to Senator Kaufman's point. But I'm seeing much more openness to talking about an enablement and capacity building framework, both in legislation and oversight, than I expected to. But it's also, very early days in sort of engagement with Hill staffers. I'm hopeful.
Just building on Jennifer's point, I think the elephant in the room is, the people who actually are involved in paying benefits to workers and making those decisions day in and day out, got tired in 2020 and 2021. They were working, 12-hour days, 6 days a week. We lost a lot of really great staff to burnout. We lost over half of the UI directors in the country. A huge bulk of the calls that I get from local journalists is, why is my state the worst state? There's not sufficient support given to the people who run the program and the people who actually pay the benefits. And to be honest, if you want to know where a system is breaking down, ask the frontline workers. They know exactly where things are going wrong. They know not only just where are people getting hung up, where are people getting through, a lot of these fraudulent benefits, if they have human eyes on them, it's pretty easy to see sometimes that this is a pattern. Greater love and care to the state UI agencies and their staff would actually go a long way toward making things more sustainable and improving integrity.
Now, I promised that about this time in the discussion, we would open things up to audience questions, and we have a couple, and I don't want to fall behind if we start getting more. So let me jump to these audience questions, but I might come back to some others because there's so many very interesting threads we can follow here. We have two questions, and they sort of relate to something similar. One of the questions asks about what I'll call kind of bad faith oversight in a way, where you have people with an agenda, and the IRS is the example that the person asking the question uses, where there is a lot of political resistance to efforts to invest in IRS capacity because of a partisanation, a politicization of the issue of the IRS's role and what it should be doing. That's one question. Is like, what do we do about that? Number two, in many cases, you've got a system that's oppositional. You've got 435 members of Congress. you've got 100 senators and they're all trying to kind of get on the front page and make names for themselves. So how do we steer our government efforts, our oversight efforts toward more productive and good faith kinds of exchanges with the bureaucracy? Do you see any, Jennifer? It sounded like you're hearing more openness to that sort of outcomes oriented approach. Are there more things we can do and push in this direction? I think is what the audience members are asking.
Yeah, I think there's a specific point there about when I've been talking, I've assumed that everybody wants the same thing, right? And it's certainly sometimes the case that, yeah, there are folks that don't want the agency to succeed in its mission. And I'm certain that's true, it has been true of the IRS, and there are others as well. And it certainly complicates things. It's interesting to bring up the IRS at this moment because we have just had such a success with Direct File. And that may speak a little bit also to a couple things that we've talked about. One is just extraordinary leadership on the part of Commissioner Werfel, who really saw the, building the capacity of that organization to deliver that as key and sort of provided great leadership in the same way that Commissioner Asaro Angelo in New Jersey did. It was like in the meetings all the time at a level that you just don't see you just rarely see, where somebody at a high level who is thought of as a politics and policy person is deeply involved in the implementation of a program that, we should also lift that up so much higher because it is how we get these good outcomes. But speaking to oversight on Direct File, just as an example of a place where it really worked, Direct File was a limited launch rollout. So it only served people with a very small set of circumstances. And it was only in, someone correct me, 9 or 12 states? 9, 12. So I, for instance, got quite a few calls in the months between, well, literally just weeks between the launch of the program and the filing deadline, mostly actually from journalists, but they're part of our oversight infrastructure too, saying, how is this? This is terrible. Why would you roll out a program to such a small number of people? This must be a failure on the part of the IRS. To which I responded, if you've ever used Yelp, it started in just San Francisco and then spread to New York and then spread elsewhere. Were you on the waiting list for Blue Sky, which was a thing a couple, 6 months ago? Yeah, a limited rollout to a small group is exactly how technology that we like to use is built. But for some reason, we hold technology and government to this completely different bar and expect it to work. And I think it's that bar, whether it's Congress or the public or the press, that really needs to be examined. Where can we give the agencies the kind of flexibility that the private sector has to do the right thing? It ended up being a great success. The numbers are good. The narratives from users are off the hook good. People love using this thing because Commissioner Werfel fought for that team's ability to do something that seemed like a bad idea to a lot of people in oversight. And will it eventually serve all states? Yes. I can't tell you when. And in fact, I can't tell you for sure that it will, because I think officially, IRS has not announced whether they're going to continue the pilot or not. But that's a great example of where setting an expectation, per Michael's thing earlier about sort of getting on the same page. This is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. Can really, really just let an agency succeed. And that's part of the capacity building that I'm talking about. And well, I guess that's more of the enablement part that I'm talking about.
Yeah, just perfect example of not biting off more than you can chew at the start, trying it out, see if it works, you are so much better off getting a positive than going everywhere. And even if it's an 80% success, the focus will be on the 20% failure, right? That's how things naturally happen. And just to the question of the concern about the politicization issue, frankly, that's why IGs were created. That's why GAO was created, which is to stay away from that, which is what we do. We're not in the moment. We might be criticized as gotcha or, too much after the fact, and we're trying to address that. But the one thing we don't do is get involved in the politics of things, which is, I think, why we're so important in this discussion of how do you move forward in a way that's effective with oversight, but keep, the politics, big P politics. There's always going to be small P politics, but big P politics, partisan politics out of it.
So many of the programs we've been talking about or could talk about in this are federal state partnerships. Obviously we've been talking about UI. We haven't talked a lot about Medicaid, but Medicaid is another example of a federal state partnership where there have been significant problems with people being able to access them. And there are obviously concerns about waste, fraud, and abuse. You could even jump to other kinds of programs like environmental programs or housing programs that have a federal and state component to them. Michael, you talked about the work that PRAC has done and probably some other IGs that you work with in your SIGI, in the role you played at SIGI. You talked a lot about working with state auditors. Could you describe in more detail sort of how that has worked, what kinds of organizations you're working with to sort of do this, to try to gather the information and do the oversight that's necessary in this system where so much actually happens at the state level, even though a lot of the dollars and authority come from the feds?
Well, and one of the fair critiques of the federal IG community, as is often the case with federal agencies, is we're not engaging with our counterparts at the state and local level sufficiently. And that's something that was a fair criticism of us. One of the things we realized right away also we needed to overcome. So one of the first things we did was reach out to the National Association of State Auditors, Controllers, and Treasurers to work with our counterparts at the local level, because as well as local auditors, I should add as well, county auditor organizations, to make sure we understood what was happening on the ground. These were programs where money was going to help communities in particular, right? The idea was to get the money to small businesses on the ground and to people who are unemployed and others. And so we immediately started meeting regularly with our counterparts there. We also made connections with the National Association of State Workforce Agencies, which run those unemployment insurance programs for the state agencies. And we met with them regularly, and we were in the practice of getting together and letting them know right away where we were finding program integrity issues, what the challenges were. So they were hearing in real time what they were, and they were letting us know the challenges they were having with executive branch federal agencies, so that we could be in a real-time relationship with them. And it was, I think, critical to the success of our oversight efforts, their oversight efforts, and is something we need to keep moving forward on. And frankly, federal agencies need to do that with their counterparts more closely. I know a lot of work's gone on. Michele was part of one of our programs at the PRAC, talking about efforts that the Labor Department had been making to try and change or improve that dynamic with state workforce agencies during this sort of unexpected time where you really needed to rethink what you were doing and how you were relating to people. And hopefully that will continue going forward as we move on. The closer you get to the ground on where money's going, the better enabled you will be to make sure the program's well run from the agency standpoint and overseen properly from an oversight standpoint.
I'm probably going to sound like a little bit of a broken record here, but funding, it comes back to funding in some cases. The national office running unemployment insurance was only about 40 FTE going into the pandemic. The regional offices, which do a lot of the oversight, were cut by a quarter of where we're down to about a quarter of the staffing that they had previously had before, decades ago. And so, without that lack of resources at the federal level, it's really hard to, do the kinds of things that that are optimal to really help, bolster that federal state partnership. We were able to hire on a whole lot of people at the Department of Labor to provide more technical assistance to states in doing all of the things that they need to do. But of course, that funding has gone away. So again, it all comes back to having the resources to be able to manage these things.
Forgot to take myself off mute there. I couldn't agree more. It seems like what you're describing, Michele, is part of a policymaking apparatus that does not focus proper attention on the capacity of the system into which new legislation or big budget decisions are made. I think it speaks to what Senator Kaufman's talking about with trying to orient Alaska toward a strategic operating plan that integrates budgeting into it and is fed off of outcomes. I want to go to you, Senator Kaufman, because I want to pick up on something that you talked about and you've described in your bio. You serve on the Budget and Audit Committee and have really championed a framework that the legislature should be using to deal with audit results to address the concerns that are raised in state in the work that's done by your auditors. Can you talk about that framework a little bit and how it balances fraud prevention and ensuring access?
Thank you. Yeah, when I started out in the House, now in the Senate, but when I was in the House, I got on the Legislative Budget and Audit Committee, or LB&A, and the narrative at that point was that there was this ever ascending list of audit findings. The volume was growing. The magnitude, there were some tremendous issues that were there. So very important issues, and a lot of them, along with just a lot of clutter. And as I looked at that, I thought, well, what are we doing here? We seem to just be finding and pointing at things, but we're not really providing some impetus behind resolving it. So I took our lead auditor and worked with her to set up a process where the committee would annually, we would go through and look at the key findings, and then we would aggressively seek resolution of those key findings. Now, the bandwidth is rather limited. This is a special, a joint committee, and we don't meet, twice a week or anything like that. So it's not a frequent committee, but we had the bandwidth to pick the top 10. So we just set up a process of our top 10 audit findings. And then that became part of every meeting, is how are we doing on the top 10? We created a scoring system by the dollar magnitude, the societal impact, and then what I call the hair factor. How long has this thing been growing hair? And so if it was big, expensive, important, and was hairy, let's attack that. And so we started going after those things. And what we found is those top 10 big issues, not necessarily handled to closure. Most of them were closed out and were resolved. And one was like a $1.3 billion internal lawsuit. And so I got to help cause a $1.3 billion lawsuit because it was the executive legislative branch haggling over how money should be handled within our internal accounting processes. So they were big things, they were important things, and they were just sitting there sometimes for years. And by just kicking off that simple little process and then getting that baked into the rule book that we use for that committee, we now have standardized on that process. So what was once what I call a misery index of just, hey, we're worse and worse and worse, and the problems are accruing, we started to turn that into an improvement process. I feel what was important was not just doing that with those findings, but also starting to create that culture of creating, the Pareto process of identifying the critical few, attacking those. And in attacking those, you're dragging awareness along with it, general awareness that, hey, there's a process by which we can resolve these problems. And so that's what we did in LB&A. I want to go back to something that was mentioned before about government constantly accruing, in this case, not only audit findings, but also work, just new rules for more work. Well, I have a type of legislation that I refer to as tinker bills because they just do a little tinkering with the system. And so we passed two of them. They create a biennial cycle. So every 2 years, there's an internal review process now that we created legislatively. The first one was for unneeded reports. And so every 2 years, the executive branch already has a list of all the publications, documents that they produce. They have that list. The legislation simply asks that they go through that list to look for what can be reduced, consolidated, removed, done electronically rather than printing. And as I described earlier, Alaska is a big place. So if you're shipping stacks of paper reports around the places, do they really need to be? So it just drove that biennial reconciliation of the reports, which, if you think about it, includes the intellectual activity, the intellectual property, the work to produce, create, distribute, ultimately to throw away if they're paper. And so every 2 years now, there's a review process to reduce that. And then we took the same mechanism and we applied it towards accounting. We create accounts. Sometimes we park money in there and it all sits and it can sit for decades where we've created this little pigeonhole account and it's sitting there. And so now every 2 years, there's a cycle to look through the accounts that we create and look at those and say, do we need that account? Do we need to track this, or can it be swept into the general fund? Just to avoid that pigeonholing of money that can occur when you write legislation, and a part of that is to create, the funding tag for it. And maybe for whatever reason, it's no longer required. Well, all of these things accrue unless you create the mechanisms to drive that continuous improvement cycle to go through, review, analyze, and decide upon the path forward. And in this case, in those two bills, it's to close the account, sweep the funds, and in the case of publications, consolidate, do it electronically, or otherwise reduce the workload. So if you can take mechanisms like that and start to plug them in, they will ultimately help support a more holistic continuous improvement mentality and a waste reduction process.
Well, I wanted to, I really appreciate that overview of the way you approach dealing with audit findings. And to me, what you've just identified, Senator, is something we were talking about earlier, which is not, taking your top 10 audit material findings and doing something about them and prioritizing them. That's not unlike this idea we were talking about before, which is, piloting or starting at a smaller scale the things that need to be attacked rather than trying to, attack the entire, waterfront of challenges. I'd like to, we're beginning to run short on time. There's one thing Michele's talked a lot and others have talked a lot about resources, about funding, about authority. I didn't want this opportunity to pass without getting some of your thoughts about proposals to institutionalize and expand an entity like PRAC. So, Michael, you've expressed some support for some legislation that has been introduced by Senator Peters and Senator Romney that would enact a successor to PRAC and task it with identifying fraud in a much larger scope. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit about your thoughts about that legislation, and certainly ask anybody else who's familiar with it to chime in and give their thoughts.
Yeah, it would. Senator Peters, chairman of the Homeland Security Government Affairs Committee, is working with Senator Romney, Senator Langford, and Senator Rosen are co-sponsoring it as well. It has, I think, broad bipartisan support. It would continue the PRAC in a new form called the Government Spending Oversight Committee, and it would expand the list of programs over which we would have oversight. All SBA programs, Labor Department programs, Inflation Reduction Act, several other bills, all grants, $50,000 or more, which is most grants or a large number of grants, federal government. And the idea being the PRAC has worked well in partnering with OMB leadership teams to try and address change that need to happen and to improve the data analytics. We have our Data Analytics Center. We have MOUs, agreements in place with lots of agencies to share data. And what we really want to be is an entity that provides service to agencies so they can figure out before they start spending money, how to make sure the money's going to the right place and reduce the level of improper payments and fraud. It's not going to stop it altogether. And any system that pretends it could is not realistic, right? It's just even things like I said that found $5.4 billion in potential fraud, simple matching, simple things the government can do to dissuade fraudsters and improve programs. Because one of the things we know from the work we do as oversight in our oversight spaces, if you can put a couple of hurdles in front of fraudsters, you will eliminate most of the fraud, because most people who commit fraud do it because it's easy to do and it's available to them. That won't stop organized crime rings. We've seen actors in Russia, China, other parts of the globe who partook in the fraud here. People who are more sophisticated, that's a harder process. And that's where, picking up on what everybody said, ramping up as you learn is the way to go. So you're not stopping money from going out to everybody. But what we'd like to do is continue this so that we can take those steps and have in there OMB give guidance to all agencies to work with this new entity to try and give them information early on so they can improve their operations.
Other comments on the proposal, if you're familiar with it?
Could I comment on just an adjacent idea to that? I think that the notion of sustainment over time is so critical. So Michelle's talked a lot about funding. I agree with her. But the way we fund in these bursts is incredibly damaging to the agencies. I've shown, folks in the private sector how we fund, unemployment insurance systems, and they're like, how do you get anything done? That's insane. We would never fund a system that's supposed to work on an ongoing basis with these big spikes of funding that then drop down to nothing. And I think that's just generally, problematic, this notion that we have attention on something and then we don't. But I also think that as it relates, again, to, oversight and legislative bodies, we're often very focused on sort of what is happening right now and what outcome we're getting, and neglecting just the health. And we have a question here about the civil service. It's a great question because the civil service is what matters. My metaphor when I talk to the public about this is, you think that you're electing a leader to be a gardener in the sense of planting seeds, and you want them to plant these, write these bills. And if those bills grow into, they become law, they grow into something that provides shade or fruit or flowers to the public, well, that's why you'll re-elect them. But anybody who's ever gardened knows that planting seeds is 0.01% of the work. It's tending the soil. And we need far more focus by everybody in the system on the health of the soil. Is it, does it have the water that it needs? It's sun, it's, is it fertilized? And of course, we've talked about this sort of legislative, the regulatory and policy cruft. Those are the weeds. You can't plant seeds in a garden that's choked with weeds. And so I think this idea that we just need these things, whether it's PRAC or the capabilities of an agency to deliver as an ongoing stream where we're looking at the health of the organization instead of a moment in time when we're always going to be reactive. And over time, we are trying to extract more and more out of that, the soil of the civil service. Of course, if we're not paying attention over time, it's not going to work for us in emergencies.
Other comments?
I just want to double down on everything everybody said. We're expecting these right now, these 53 historically underfunded state agencies to be the tip of the spear against, the Russian mob, when these fraud rings are attacking all over government. And that's why it's so important that we have, major national attention to the fraud problem, because it's largely not a lot of the identity fraud is not due to any leak by the state agency. These are larger entities, and they're attacking everywhere. So attention, collaboration across government and across the private sector is important too.
Well, I think we have come to the end of our time together, and let me just thank each of you, thank our audience first for joining us and asking some great questions and being part of this conversation. Thank you to our panelists who really have come forward with some wonderful ideas. I think we, I would just say that what I have taken away from this conversation really would fall into a few areas. One would be a focus on the systems that we're operating within, the systems we're trying to improve. We've got to be attentive to their own capacities, and we've got to be willing and have the courage to define a more limited set of objectives initially and get that right and achieve some success in combating fraud and waste while also expanding access to these benefits, and that this is not the work of a few months or a few years. This is an ongoing commitment, and these bursts of frenzied activity, usually around some crisis like a recession or a disaster, are that's not the way to really run a system that we're trying to improve continuously. And finally, that we really need a federal-state partnership that is robust, where there are enough resources and authority at the federal level along the lines, perhaps of what's being proposed in the Senate now and in the House, but also that there needs to be a greater investment in state resources and in the agencies, federal agencies and state agencies that are really charged with getting these benefits and these systems to be accessible. So with that, I really want to thank everyone again. This will be available on our website, levin-center.org, within a few hours, certainly by tomorrow. And we hope you will continue to be engaged with us and with all of my colleagues here on this panel. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.